Last lesson, we discussed imperialism in Africa and the scramble for Africa, as well as the Boer War between the Dutch and the English. Today, let's look at what's going on in Asia and imperialism. Well, let's start with China. Significant imperialist activity also took place in China. Under the Ming and Qing dynasties, Europeans had traded silver for Chinese tea. This all changed in the 1800s when Spain lost control of its silver supply from the Americas. The British soon discovered, however, that Indian opium, which they controlled, could also prove profitable. Chinese authorities forbade opium imports in 1796. Although the Chinese instituted severe penalties for those caught smoking opium, this includes death in some cases, the opium trade flourished. Within a generation, opium addiction in China became widespread. The picture in this slide gives an impression of the huge volume of opium imported into China by the British. The East India Company developed a monopoly on opium cultivation in India, but disengaged itself legally and officially from the illicit trade with China by using vessels owned by private merchants. The boats were known as country ships to transfer the sale of opium in China. So it's like they're pretending not to do it. In 1839, the Emperor of China sent a commissioner to Canton to put an end to the opium trade. The British ignored these demands, and the Chinese government responded by having the commissar destroy 20,291 chests of opium. This action ultimately led to a war between British and the Chinese. The Opium War. Britain, with its powerful navy, occupied several Chinese ports, including Hong Kong. British armies also met with success, coming within miles of Peking, the Chinese capital. In 1842, the Chinese conceded and British forces forced them to sign a treaty. So China lost the Opium War to Britain. So let's talk about this treaty. The treaty forced China to accept some major concessions and further opened the country to European trade. The Second Opium War broke out in 1856 and lasted until 1860. This time, combined British and French forces defeated the Chinese and forced another treaty upon them. Concessions by the Chinese included opening up 11 more cities to European trade and allowing Christian missionaries to proselytize within the country. That means to spread Christianity. The treaty, however, made no reference to opium. From the Chinese perspective, this war marked the beginning of a period of semi-colonialism that subjected much of the country to Europe. So you see, China is no longer in charge of its own trade, its own economy, its own laws. It tried to outlaw opium, and the Europeans said, "Nope, you can't outlaw that, and you must trade, and you got to do these things." It's a form of colonialism. Maybe they didn't occupy the country, but they were still controlling it. The map on this slide shows how the treaties that followed the Opium Wars opened up China to foreign trade. You can see along the major rivers and the coast where the British controlled the trade. The open door policy. At the end of the 19th century, China was in political and social turmoil. Many nations wanted to capitalize on China's unsettled situation, including Japan, Russia, Britain, France, and Germany. These nations wanted to create spheres of influence in the region. That is to say, they wanted to gain virtual control over economies and politics in China. While the United States did not necessarily seek a sphere of influence in China, it did have a prosperous trade with the nation. U.S. Secretary of State John Hay sent a series of open-door notes to various nations, proposing that they all share their Chinese trading rights, while also guaranteeing the territorial integrity of China. Hay's proposals were meant not only to assure that no nation would monopolize trade with China, but also to prevent other nations from partitioning China. That means to take it bit by bit, piece by piece. None of the other nations interested in China particularly liked the open door policy, and none formally endorsed it. But they also didn't take any actions that ran counter to the open door policy's provisions. Cathedrals like this one, built in Shanghai in the late 1800s, were a clear indication of the influence of Europeans. This is a form of cultural dominance, another form of imperialism. In response to the European presence in China, nationalist groups emerged and organized in hopes of removing foreign influence from the country. One group, named the Harmonious Fists, called the Boxers by Europeans, attacked foreign missionaries, Chinese Christians, and government officials they held responsible for allowing Europeans to dominate China. In mid 1900, close to 150,000 Boxers occupied Beijing. An international force composed of European and American and Japanese soldiers occupied Beijing and defeated the Boxers. This is what's known as the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxer Protocol was signed on September 7th, 1901. This is something, again, China was forced to do that the Europeans wanted it to do. It required to pay damages to Europeans and was forced to allow foreign soldiers to live in Beijing. In 1911, imperial rule ended in China. The KMT National Army under Chiang Kai shek led a campaign that resulted in the establishment of a republican government. This government lasted in a weakened state until 1949, when communists took over China. The picture in this slide is of a nationalist poster around 1927. The club hitting the two characters says, "Force of the people." Signs in the background read, "Unite and overthrow all warlords and imperialists," and "The Great Alliance of Farmers, Workers, Soldiers, Businessmen, and Students." There's some discussion questions for the end of this lesson.